A cause is that power or agent which produces anything or event. The idea of a cause implies a purpose, goal or end, so that it has reference to persons and to God. The concept of causality has been replaced in relativistic, positivistic and naturalistic circles with the probability concept for precisely this reason, namely that it points to an ultimately personal first cause, God. In a world without God, events are the product of chance, not of purpose. They therefore are without cause. The framework and ground of causality is both personal and theistic. In a universe of chance, causality cannot exist. First, there will be no universe, a unified order of law, where chance prevails. Second, where chance prevails, no history is possible. A cause is a sequence of meaningful, purposive... A cause is a sequence of meaningful, purposive events, and every cause is set in the context of a universe of interlocking causes and events, so that no cause and no effect stands in isolation. Nothing can thus be explained in terms of a simplistic approach. As Custance has noted, quote, "In physiology, for example, we dissect the body, or we experiment with it only as an electrochemical machine, and our findings confirm the effectiveness of our tools of research and our own methodology by giving us the only kind of information we were looking for." But as Paul Weiss It wasn't worth it for the millisecond. But as Paul Weiss, recognizing this aspect of the inherent limitation of the scientific method, observed, quote, "Maybe our concept of nervous system crazy. Maybe our concept of our nervous system is equally inadequate and insufficient. No, why is it not recording? It's so crazy. Maybe our concept of our nervous system is equally inadequate and insufficient because so long as you only... Hello, this is Nathan. Thanks for joining me in the booth. I really hope you're enjoying the live streams and videos. To find out more about this narration project, or to make a donation, go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks. Because so long as you use only electrical instruments, you get electrical answers. If you use chemical detectors, you get chemical answers. And if you determine numerical and geometrical values, you get numerical and geometrical answers. So perhaps we have not yet found the particular kind of instrument that tells us the next unknown." End quote. It was this simplistic view of causes which led to confusion in medicine some years ago with respect to ulcers. It was quote-unquote proven that ulcers had a chemical cause. Later, of course, a psychological cause was also discovered, and there is no reason to believe that all is now known with respect to ulcers. The simplistic view is a product of a syncretistic... Got no glasses on! The simplistic view is a product of a syncretism of theistic causation with chance variation. In a world of brute factuality, nothing is tied to anything else by an overall cause or purpose, or by any inherent natural unity. In such a world as envisioned by Newtonian science, a collision of two entities resulted in something. A single collision produced a result, it was held, and thus a bastard and simplistic concept of causality resulted from this belief. Causality was seen as mechanical because, under a deistic viewpoint, God as the first cause remained somewhere in the remote past. The personal aspect was thus drained out of events by this mechanistic perspective, and later, when God was dropped as a necessary hypothesis, causality gave way to the probability concept. Purpose was thus replaced by chance. However, as John Wilson has observed, from a Christian perspective, the older view of causality is also untenable, not because causality does not exist, but because it is too complex for any simplistic usage. Causes are so multiple in the natural world that events are more readily described than traced to their causes. Turning now from the problem of causes as the scientists must work with them, let us examine causality in its broadest implications. How shall we view the world around us, and in terms of what kind of perspective of causality? Clearly, as Christians, we regard God as the ultimate and absolute cause of all things, but in what sense do we mean this? Towards this end, let us examine the events described in 2 Kings 18 and 19 and Isaiah 36 and 37. King Hezekiah's reformation of Judah, 2 Kings 18, 1-8, was apparently lacking in any depth or popular. King Hezekiah's reformation of Judah, 2 Kings 18, 1-8, was apparently lacking in any depth or popular support. According to Ellison, quote, "There is no mention or commendation of this reformation in either Isaiah or Micah. The reason is that, as these prophets show, it was purely external." The reason is that, as these prophets show, it was purely external, and even at the courts there was no real trust. Sorry, folks. Not getting the flow. And even at the courts, there was no real trust in Jehovah, as was shown by Judah's alliance with Egypt and a lack of moral reformation. Isaiah 28:7, 31:9. He rebelled against the king of Assyria, 7. The result was disastrous, and there is no indication that Isaiah approved. End quote. When Assyria moved against Judah, the national resistance collapsed, and many joined the enemy to fight against their own people or to be used by them elsewhere, or else had left the country. Sennacherib, 704-681 BC, referred to this in an account of his conquests. Quote, "As to Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, walled forts, and to the countless small villages in their vicinity, and conquered them by means of well-stamped earth ramps and battering rams brought thus near to the walls, combined with the attack by foot soldiers using mines, breaches, as well as sapper work. I drove out of them 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, big and small cattle beyond counting, and considered them booty. Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence like a bird in a cage. I surrounded him with earthwork in order to molest those who were leaving his city's gate. Its towns..." His towns which I had plundered I took away from his country and gave them over to Mitai, king of Ashdod, Padai, king of Ekron, and Tilabel, king of Gaza. Thus I reduced his country, but I still increased the tribute and the katru, presents, due to me as his overlord, which I imposed later upon him beyond the former tribute to be delivered annually. Hezekiah himself, whom the terror-inspiring splendour of my lordship have overwhelmed, and whose irregular and elite troops which he had brought into Jerusalem, his royal residence, in order to strengthen it, had deserted him, did send me later to Nineveh, my lordly city, together with 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, precious stones, antimony, large cuts of red stone, couches inlaid with ivory, couches inlaid with ivory, Nemedu chairs inlaid with ivory, elephant hides, ebony wood, boxwood, and all kinds of valuable treasures, his own daughters, concubines, male and female musicians. In order to deliver the tribute and to do obeisance as a slave, he sent his personal messenger. End quote. This was a brutal invasion and taxation, and it was a divine judgment. Judah had placed its hope in an Egyptian alliance rather than in God. Isaiah 30:1-7. The biblical position with regard to alliances is that alliances are religious acts. An alliance means, quote, an understanding between Jehovah and the gods of the country involved, end quote, as well as between the citizens of both countries. An alliance means that a common cause and a common faith motivates the allies. The hostility of the United States in its earlier years to quote, entangling The hostility of the United States in its earlier years to, quote, entangling alliances, end quote, had this religious overtone. In antiquity, the religious aspect of alliances was always an open and avowed fact. Judah trusted in Egypt, and Egypt proved faithless. Sennacherib, despite the tribute, decided to level and destroy Jerusalem. Only when all human help had failed did Hezekiah turn to the prophet Isaiah and the Lord, Isaiah 37:1-5. God declared through Isaiah that Sennacherib would be defeated by his hand and would return to his land to be slain there, Isaiah 37:6-7. We are then told of the results, quote, and it came to pass that night, when the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000, and when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib king of Assyria departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer his son smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia. And Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. 2 Kings 19:35-37. Clearly God's judgment against Sennacherib is here depicted. Just as clearly, however, the preceding events are a judgment on Judah. Thus, every step of this history, natural and supernatural, is an act of God. Moreover, every aspect of history is an aspect of God's foreknowledge and predestination. Acts 15:18, Romans 9, etc. God's role cannot therefore be limited to the miraculous in history. It includes his absolute government of the sparrow's fall and every hair on each man's head. Matthew 10:29-30. We have noted the retreat of the idea of causality to a mechanistic concept and then to a probability hypothesis. Let us now examine the origins of the idea of causality. The history of the causality concept is inseparable from the dialectical nature of non-Christian thought. In the ancient world, as witness Greece, reality was seen as two rival substances or realms, spirit, form, ideas or light, versus matter, particulars or darkness. These two realms in non-biblical thought could be viewed in three ways with respect to their relationship. First, they could be held as both incomparable and yet necessary to one another, and thus held in dialectical tension, as in Western thought. Second, their incompatibility. Second, their incompatibility. Second, their incompatibility could be stressed to the point of an ultimate and irreconcilable difference with a resultant dualism, as in Arian or Iranian thought. Third, one or another could be held to be an illusion, with monism resulting, as in Eastern thought, the Greek Cynics or the Western mystics. For the Western mystics and Eastern thought, as and Mary Baker Eddy, matter is an illusion. For the Cynics, the world of spirit was an illusion. The nature of men's thinking on these two realms governed their views of causality. The dialectical background meant that two diverse realms existed. As Duyvert has pointed out, the Greek dialectic was ideas and matter, the medieval dialectic, grace and nature, and the modern dialectic, freedom and nature. The modern form develops an implication of the previous forms of the dialectic, namely, that the mental or spiritual realm is a world of freedom from the blind, mechanical causality of the world of nature. This is not to say that causality is absent in these perspectives from the realm of man's mind or spirit. The causality of the realm of ideas or freedom is self-caused and self-determined. It is the realm of man's autonomous mind and man's own decree of predestination. The philosopher kings of Plato, therefore, were the predestinating power over society and nature, because in them this power of self-determination had been realized. Modern socialistic concepts of predestination and social planning rest on the same premise of man's autonomous mind and its self-caused, self-determinative nature. In the existentialists, this is self-consciously held. Thus Sartre declared, quote, "My freedom is a choice of being..." My freedom is a choice of being God, and all my acts, all my projects translate this choice and reflect it in 1,001 ways, for there is an infinity of ways of being and of ways of having. End quote. To avoid the influence of the world of matter on the autonomous mind, Sartre rejected the concept of the unconscious. In order to be free, man must create his own essence without any influence from the world of God or the world of matter. Sartre's goal was to, quote, get rid of that dualism which, in the existent, opposes interior to exterior, end quote. It was the world of essence, of a predetermined nature, that Sartre wanted to eliminate. Man must be free to create his own essence, that is, issue his own degree of predestination and become his own cause without any outside interference. It is important for him to be able to say, for better or for worse, that, quote, the world is human, end quote. Long before Sartre, Oriental thought reached a similar conclusion with disastrous consequences. Disastrous consequences. This was the doctrine of karma. The material world was held to be in some sense either illusory or an illusion, and the wise man would withdraw from it or write it off. This left the world of the mind in process of disentangling itself from the world of matter or illusion, and able now to concentrate on its self-caused nature. Freedom was from the material world, and thus essentially negative. there was no freedom from self-causality except in nirvana, or death, an end to the cycle of transmigration, or and an end to the cycle of transmigration or reincarnation. In its developed form in Buddhism, little remains of man's private world of mind except a relentless causality which must be escaped. A man is a self-enclosed universe of causality, inheriting nothing from anyone else nor passing on anything to another. Every man is his own cause and effect. As Poussin observed, quote, "This doctrine might be called the essential element, not only of all moral theories in India, but also of popular belief. If a person is born deformed or unhealthy, it must be. Healthy, it must be, so people say, because of sins committed in his former life. It is in Buddhism, however, that the doctrine of karma reaches its climax and assumes a unique character. Elsewhere, it meets with correctives. There are counteractions to human acts, but in Buddhism, it may be said that karma explains everything, or ought to. Make a click noise. Other Indian philosophies admit the existence of a self-existent soul or an ego. In Buddhist philosophy, the ego is merely a collection of various elements constantly renewed, which are combined into a pseudo-personality only as a result of action. The conclusion of Oriental thought was similar to Sartre's, that, quote, "Man is a useless passion," end quote. In the Western philosophical tradition, a blind, impersonal, and later mechanical causality was held to be present in the world of quote-unquote nature. This purely physical, usually inanimate and impersonal world was governed by a cause and effect relationship which was a necessity, but was neither logical nor coercive, since logic and coercion belonged to the personal realm. Quote, "The necessity in these cases is neither that of logical implication nor that of coercion," end quote. This causality became mechanistic, as we have noted, and then gave way to a probability concept. In the world of mind or freedom, we have seen the impasse which results from either Oriental or existentialist emphases on man's self-caused and autonomous nature. The dialectical premise leads in every case to a collapse of culture and a society. The dialectical premise leads in every case to a collapse of culture and society in the face of the problems of causality and the relationship of the one and the many. The Bible is hostile to dialecticism, dualism and monism. Mind or spirit and matter are alike God's creation. The distinction is not between mind and matter, but between the uncreated being of God and the created being of the universe. God's law and causality is total and operative everywhere, and it is everywhere personal. In the case of Sennacherib, the judgment is both material and spiritual, and the deliverance of Jerusalem is both material and spiritual. There is no separation between the two realms, nor the two kinds of causality. The whole universe is one law sphere under God. However dimly we grasp aspects of that law here and there, it is both real, total, and unified. Before considering further implications, Before considering further implications of God's sovereignty, let us turn to a text cited by Custance. Let's call it Custance. God's sovereignty. Let us turn to a text cited by Constance as of central importance, Genesis 2, 1-3, quote, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all of the host of them." "And all the host of them. And the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." End quote. Custance then comments, quote, "The meaning seems clear enough, but is it? Why would God quote-unquote rest? Because he was weary? Surely not. The words must have some other meaning than merely to reflect our own weariness at the end of a week of intense activity. Indeed, the Hebrew word rendered rest is not bound at all to any idea of fatigue. It means rather, quote, to disengage, end quote, quote, to terminate active involvement in, end quote, or simply, as the New English Bible has it here, quote, to cease from, end quote. God did not stop work because he was tired, but because he had finished what he was preparing, end quote. In summoning man to exercise dominion and to subdue the earth, Genesis 1, 26-28, God was making man his agent and vicegerent in the exercise of causality in the world, summoning him from simple beginnings to continue to an unimagined scope of authority. Man, however, chose to reject this calling for an imagined self-caused destiny as his own God, Genesis 3:5. And the result was the fall and a break from the divine Sabbath. When Jesus healed the crippled man at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, he did so on the Sabbath, John 5:1, 9-10, 16. When charged with Sabbath breaking, quote, Jesus answered them, "My Father worketh hitherto, and I work," John 5:17. Turning again to Custance for a decisive comment, he points out that, quote, the word, quote, hitherto, end quote, is found in the original Greek as two words which together mean, quote, up to the present moment, end quote, that is, quote, until now, end quote. I think it means a little bit more than simply that the Father had been working now and then throughout history. I think it means a little bit more than simply that the Father had been working now and then throughout history. I suggest that the Lord really intended by his action, healing on the Sabbath day, and by his explanation, that from the moment Adam fell and the disruptive effect of sin was introduced into the natural order, God has been actively engaged continuously throughout history, constantly at work in a way which, if man had not fallen, he would not have needed to be. The cessation from work which followed immediately upon the completion of the 6 days of Genesis would have continued to this day. As a consequence, the pattern of 6 days of work followed by rest, which was based upon God's original program and was appointed as a guide for human behaviors thereafter, had broken down, so that redemptive activity had to be carried out. Why? Sometimes I cry. Had broken down so that redemptive activity had to be carried out, whether it was a working day or a rest day, whether it was a weekday or a Sabbath. It seems to me very evident that the healing miracles of the Lord were often deliberately structured to show that the repair necessary to organisms which might otherwise have operated mechanistically and faultlessly was necessitated because of the disruptive effects of the fall, of the presence of sin in life. Hence the Lord could repair the damage equally well by saying either, quote, "Be healed," end quote, or, quote, "Thy sins be forgiven thee," end quote, Mark 2, 3-12, end quote. It is not our concern here to argue with the deistic implications of the use of the word, quote-unquote, mechanistically by Custance. The point is that the work man was to do was forsaken by man. God thus had a work of restoration and regeneration to do in order to re-establish man in the Sabbath rest of God and in the exercise of dominion which accompanies that rest. The work of creation has been resumed in the form of regeneration and restitution, and Jesus Christ came into history to further this work. Quote, "Because God's creative act was total in its scope, in that, quote, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made," end quote, John 1:3, his causality is total. God's work of regeneration thus has a total scope. All creation is involved in it, either looking to God's deliverance, for which it yearns with expectant longings, Romans 8:19-22, or else reserved for his judgment. Every fact is a created and predestined fact in terms of God's purpose. The meaning of his causality will fully unfold with its realization and fulfillment, that is, when it is fully in force. This means that God is not merely a remote first cause, as in deism, but a very present cause. The reality of secondary causes is not denied by affirming that simultaneously with them God is always active. Rather, the reality of causality is affirmed. It does not become a mechanistic thing which quickly breaks down for lack of mind, meaning, or direction. Every fact is a personal fact in a personal universe, created by a personal God, and every cause has its ultimate and always immediate frame of reference in that triune God and his decree. The facts, the causes and effects of Sennacherib's invasion are grim facts. Perhaps they are for some more grim because they are ordained by God. However, apart from God, they become meaningless and senseless. Under God, every fact has reference to a total plan of creation and regeneration, to a master plan of salvation which affects all things, either to judge or to deliver, or both. God is as close to every secondary cause and as operative today as in Israel's day, and his goal remains the same: the regeneration of all things in Christ and the judgment of the things which are, so that the things which cannot be shaken may alone remain. Hebrews 12:22-29. Okay, a bit of a longer chapter. We're going to break for a cup of tea. Hope you enjoyed that. I remembered that I had two beginnings there. A false one and a true one. So hope to see you in the next chapter, chapter X111, otherwise known as X111. So hope to see you then. Well done for listening right to the end. If you would like to know more about this important Christian audiobook project, please go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks.